He spent years of his life trying to prove that all of it was nothing more than an invention. A story shaped over time, something that grew larger and larger until it became untouchable, no longer trying to destroy the narrative, but trying to understand what, within it, could actually be considered historical. Some descriptions went against what would be convenient for anyone trying to fabricate that story, and for a long time, that belief made perfect sense to him. There were no flawless records. No clean, unbroken chain of evidence connecting everything. It was exactly the kind of scenario where myths are born, and that's why he decided to investigate. Strange. And that made things even more unsettling, but not as a curious observer, as someone determined to dismantle it completely. He wasn't just anyone. He was a specialist. One of the most respected names when it came to ancient history and religious texts. Someone who knew every detail, every contradiction, every possible inconsistency. And more importantly, someone who had no commitment to faith. In fact, he had left that behind a long time ago. And maybe that's exactly what makes all of this even more unsettling. Because when someone who already believes finds something, you expect Italiano, not just what was written, but what happened afterward. But when someone who doesn't believe starts noticing patterns, inconsistencies, unexpected confirmations, everything changes. At first, everything followed the expected path. He began by analyzing the oldest available texts, comparing versions, looking for copying errors, alterations, exaggerations. And yes, he found them. Many of them. Small changes here, adjusted words there, details that clearly weren't present in the earliest records. To him, that was enough proof that the story had been modified over time. But then came the first break. He realized that despite all the variations, there was something that remained constant, something that didn't disappear. No matter which version he examined, a core, a foundation that stayed intact even when everything else seemed to shift. And that shouldn't happen, because when a story is invented and reshaped over time, it usually distorts completely. Central elements change, characters evolve, events lose coherence. But in this case, that wasn't happening. That core remained. And that's when he decided to go beyond the most familiar texts. He started looking for external records, independent sources, people who had no interest in defending that story. And this is where Musa would expect to find nothing. Silence, a complete absence of any mention. But that's not what happened. He found references. Small, indirect, but present. And the problem wasn't just finding them. It was the fact that these references came from people who had no reason to confirm anything. In fact, some of them openly rejected that movement, and still, they recorded it. That created discomfort, because now, this was no longer just about belief or faith. It was history, documentation, indirect evidence, but consistent. And the deeper he went, the stranger it became. He began reconstructing timelines, cross-checking information, comparing accounts, and something started to emerge. Something he didn't expect, because somehow, even with all the flaws, all the changes, all the gaps, there was an overall coherence, a structure that made sense, and that didn't fit his original assumption. Because if it were purely a myth built over time, it would be chaotic, disorganisé, filled with contradictions that couldn't be reconciled. But that Wasn't he exactly what he was seeing? And at that point, he asked a simple but dangerous question. What if I'm trying to prove the wrong thing? That question changes everything. Up until then, the entire investigation had one clear goal. Dismantle it, find flaws, show that it couldn't be. But now, for the first time, he considered the possibility that he had been approaching it from the wrong angle, and that opened a door he hadn't planned to open. He started reevaluating the same data, but from a different perspective. And that's when more problems appeared, because some things simply didn't make sense as invention. Certain details were too uncomfortable to have been created. Elements that, if false, would likely have been adjusted, removed, improved, but they weren't. They were still there. Because in historical analysis, when a narrative includes elements that don't benefit the people telling it, that increases the likelihood of authenticity. It doesn't prove everything, but it raises a different kind of suspicion. And now he was surrounded by those kinds of details. He tried to ignore it, tried to rationalize it, tried to force everything back into his original framework. But the more he tried to simplify it, the more complex it became. And then he noticed something else. Impact. Because regardless of what anyone believes, there's one thing that's difficult to ignore. That event, that story, triggered something massive. Something that spread too fast, too powerfully, in a context where that kind of growth wasn't common. And that also needs an explanation. Movements don't expand like that without a strong foundation, without something sustaining them, without something that convinces people enough to completely change their lives. And he began to wonder what exactly happened there to cause all of this. Because now, it wasn't just about texts anymore. It was about consequences. And consequences are harder to dismiss than words. That's when the investigation stopped being comfortable. Because he was no longer just analyzing ancient documents. He was dealing with a scenario where multiple pieces, even imperfect ones, were starting to fit together in a way he hadn't expected. And the further he went, the stronger that strange feeling became. That maybe, just maybe, there was something there that couldn't be dismissed so easily. But he still hadn't reached the most critical point. There was still something missing, something he only found later, almost by accident, when he decided to investigate a very specific detail that most people simply ignore. A small detail, almost irrelevant, but when examined closely, it started to raise a much deeper and much harder question to answer. Because that detail wasn't isolated. It appeared across different records, in different contexts, coming from sources that had no direct connection to each other. And when that happens in historical analysis, you can't just ignore it. You have to take a closer look. So that's exactly what he did. He began to follow that detail like a thread, pulling it slowly, connecting points, comparing versions. At first, it seemed too small to change any real conclusion. But as he went deeper, it started to grow. Because that detail was tied to a specific moment. A moment described in a strange way, almost outside the norm, and for a long time, it had been treated as just part of the narrative. But when he decided to isolate it, to study it, without the weight of tradition, without the filter of belief, he noticed something unexpected. It wasn't as common as it seemed. He started searching for historical parallels, other events like it, records of similar situations from the same period. And that's when an even bigger problem appeared. There weren't many. In fact, almost none that fit perfectly. And that started to bother him, because once again, if this were just an invented story, it would be much easier to use something familiar, something recognizable, something with clear precedents. But that's not what he found. What was described there was unusual. And in history, the unusual stands out. So, he decided to approach it differently. Instead of forcing that detail into ready-made explanations, he began analyzing its consequences. What did it imply? What did it produce? How did it affect the rest of the narrative? And slowly, he realized that this small detail supported far more than it seemed. It was as if multiple parts of the story depended on it to make sense, and that shifted the weight of the entire investigation, because now, dismissing that point meant dismantling several other elements that, up until then, appeared coherent, and accepting it meant opening the door to something he wasn't ready to accept. And this is where the investigation enters a more uncomfortable zone, because it's no longer about proving or disproving. It's about dealing with probabilities. He started organizing everything more clinically, listing what was certain, what was probable, what was uncertain, separating emotion from analysis and ebb and ten. A pattern was forming, a pattern he couldn't ignore, because piece by piece, what once looked like a story shaped over time began to resemble something that had a real point of origin, even if parts of it had been altered along the way. And for someone who started out trying to prove the opposite, that carries weight. But there was still one final step, something he had avoided for a long time, bringing everything together. Not just the texts, not just the external references, not just the isolated details, but all of it, as a system, as a whole, us. And when he finally did that, that's when the most difficult moment arrived, because for the first time, he didn't just find inconsistencies. He found a structure that, despite its imperfections, held not perfectly, but enough that it couldn't be easily dismissed. And that creates a different kind of silence. Not the silence of someone who has no answer, but the silence of someone who realizes the answer isn't as simple as they once thought, because he didn't suddenly become someone who believed blindly. That's not what happened. He continued analyzing, questioning, maintaining his skepticism. But no, with a new problem. He could no longer say with the same confidence that everything was just invention, and that changes everything, because in many cases, it's not about having absolute certainty, but about no longer being able to deny certain possibilities. And maybe that's exactly what makes this story so compelling. It's not about someone who found definitive proof and completely switched sides. It's about someone who walked in with certainty and walked out with doubts that didn't exist before. And sometimes, doubt is more powerful than certainty, because it doesn't let you ignore things. It stays there, lingering, returning, demanding answers. And that's exactly what happens when someone who had no reason to believe starts finding reasons to question their disbelief. Now, I want to hear from you. If even someone completely skeptical, with access to the best methods and years of study, reached this point, what do you think it really means? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this discussion goes much deeper than it seems. And if you like this kind of content, where we go beyond the obvious and explore stories that almost no one explains properly, make sure to subscribe and leave a like, because there's a lot more coming, and some of these stories are even harder to ignore.